So if you do find this discussion helpful, please do share this video with anyone that you think may also benefit from the learnings from our team. And if you'd like to initiate a conversation around your IT cloud initiatives and challenges or operational needs that you're facing, let us know at thesummitgrp.com. We can help with a fully funded cloud roadmap or cloud cost analysis based on your needs, among other services that we can offer. The group of experts before you were organized to discuss trends in leveraging the cloud for banking and financial institutions looking for business and technical guidance. My name is Gio Tropiano. I'm with Summit Technology Group, and by way of introductions, Don Spadell is with us from Summit Technology Group. He's our lead cloud architect. He heads up a team of cloud engineers here at STG. He's an AWS ambassador, and he resides in Central PA. Today, Don will be sharing his thoughts on trends in the application migration to the cloud. Greg Colburn is also with us of Summit Technology Group. He's our software-defined data center practice director. Having helped customers with hybrid cloud, converged, and hyperconverged infrastructures in the past, he has extensive experience including 8+ years at Dell, 14+ years at Microsoft. He sits in the Charlotte, North Carolina area, and today Greg will be sharing his thoughts on cloud cybersecurity. Shad McNair, part of the STG group here on our team, is a software-defined data center director as well. After almost 18 years as a customer engineer and consultant at Dell, he not only has experience designing business challenge solving technical solutions, but he also has hands-on experience installing them. He's an ISC2 cybersecurity certified and resides in the Northeast and Southeastern New Hampshire. Shad will be leading the charge today on cloud disaster recovery and ransomware recovery. And our final panelist is our guest from AWS, Pradeep Dhananjaya. He's a principal tech lead for worldwide banking at AWS, having engineering experience both at JP Morgan and Morgan Stanley. He brings web engineering knowledge and experience in the banking sector that's sure to add a lot of color to today's discussion, specifically around ransomware recovery. So welcome everyone once again. I'd like to start off with the topic of application migration to the cloud. Don, what are some of the common concerns and challenges that you're hearing about when migrating applications to the cloud?
Good question. Yeah, thanks for the intro. Thanks everybody for joining. Frequently, I mean, it sounds kind of like a basic question, but I hear, how do I know if cloud migration is the right move? Sounds basic, but there's a lot of thought and consideration that goes into deciding to migrate to the cloud. And usually I would answer that by asking some questions of my own, such as what are your current pain points running apps on-prem? And you know, IT folks kind of get used to kind of how things are, and if there are pain points, it's you just kind of get used to things. And but when you really stop and think about it, there can be a lot. So I hear a lot about aging hardware, unsupported like hardware that's out of support, or software that's out of support as well. Switches, routers, all the other things besides compute that can age and needs to be replaced. Some organizations have a data center lease, and that might be coming up for renewal, and they're kind of thinking, oh, am I going to get locked into another 3 or 5 year commitment? And that weighs heavily as well, especially in the financial side. Limited capacity, running out of capacity. Do we add more storage? We try to consolidate, dedupe things, and move things around. And also uptime. Perhaps you've had a history of outages. They kind of just become common. Oh yeah, usually a couple times a week we have some sort of problem. So when you hear all that stuff together, it's like, yeah, it might be a good idea to consider cloud. There's a couple other questions too, because you can't just, oh yeah, I'm going to go to cloud and go there. You need to consider security requirements. I usually ask about that. Validating that various cloud services can meet them, and leveraging the cloud native tooling that comes with various cloud providers to be able to meet them. And then another thing to consider, I would say, would be training. So the skill set of running traditional data centers on-prem or in a data center is a little bit different in the cloud world. So kind of that traditional system administrator versus cloud administrator, and kind of some certain networking concepts are different on-prem and in cloud. So those are all things to consider as well.
So Don, if I can jump in real quick and ask a question. When you're thinking about these applications, when a customer comes in and says, hey, I'm considering making the move from my on-prem environment into a cloud data center, there's different approaches that can be taken, whether it's, hey, I want to pick this up in kind of a lift and shift model versus a complete application refactoring. Can you kind of talk through some of the considerations that goes into the trade-offs you get for those two different things? And are there trends you're seeing specifically with the customers that we work with here at Summit around, are they leaning one way or the other? And what does that landscape sort of look like?
Yeah, you're right. There are many different ways to do migration. It's not necessarily just picking up a server that we have here and then figuring out the appropriately sized server in the cloud world and moving everything one for one, like for like. A trend to migrate to the cloud with shifting as much of the management away as possible, getting out of the hardware business, getting out of the patching business, all that stuff. You can offload most of that by shifting your on-premises software to a SaaS-based model. So think of like a Office 365 or various services like a Salesforce, something like that, where you're not managing any of the hardware. You just are concerned with permissions granted in the application and configuration of the application. So that's certainly one way to do it. We're seeing a lot of that. In my opinion, that should be kind of a first step in your considerations. Can we move to a SaaS model? Because that offloads most of the management. And then you can do a lift and shift, as you were saying, that's kind of like all the way on the other side of the scale. Figuring out exactly what servers you need and operating systems and doing all that sort of thing. And that's certainly very viable. In some cases, it might be your only option if you have some like very customized software that needs to be in a certain way. You might have to do it that way. Or there's certainly room in the middle for modernizing the application, maybe containerize it and then run it containers in the cloud. Or taking advantage of some cloud native services, functions as a service in Amazon, that would be Lambda. So yeah, it definitely depends on the workload, depends on how the workloads talk to each other as well. If you have latency considerations, things like that. But yeah, it's not a one size fits all solution. It'll vary depending on workload and what your goals are as well.
Hey, Don. You mentioned one of the questions you asked, or one of the a potential driver for looking at cloud is unsupported, not just hardware, but unsupported software. I'm curious what you've seen. How easy is it for a customer if they have an application that's running on an unsupported OS? And we know we see a lot of that where you're in the banking world and there's a lot of off-the-shelf applications. If they're stuck with something that they can't modernize on the application side itself, but it's running on an old OS that's no longer supported, what are the options? Is it easy to is that like a containerized solution? What are the options to help customers in those situations?
Yeah, there's a couple of different options. Yeah, one of them would be to really try to put in the time and effort to see if it can work on a modern operating system, but you don't want to venture too far into some unknown territory with off-the-shelf software trying to kind of rig up something that might work on the new system. So I know Amazon in particular offers an app discovery service as part of their migrate to the cloud, where it can go in and see what the application is like, what the dependencies are, what the relationships are on an old server. It can kind of package it up into put it into a little bubble. And then once you land it on Amazon, that bubble can kind of run on a server running a modern operating system. So there are ways to kind of, it's not strictly containerization, but it's kind of wrapping it up, abstracting away all the parts where it talks to its old operating system, and then make it work on a modern operating system. And we've seen that a couple of times. We're involved in some engagements now where we're doing that.
Don, what about right sizing the cloud environment? What's an approach that you would recommend? There's oversubscription that has happened in the past for virtual guests, and so that folks don't overspend. What is an approach to right sizing a cloud environment?
Yeah, that's one of the really great benefits of the cloud is the scalability, the ability to scale out, adding more instances, ability to scale up, making those instances larger, and then auto scaling, kind of expanding and contracting on demand. So it's great. Unlike the on-prem world, you don't have to just lock in and pick what size server you think you want, and you're stuck with that for a few years. You can kind of just take a best guess. There's tools that we can use to kind of analyze the workload that you have. And if you want to do a lift and shift, kind of figure out what size instances we might want to start with. And yeah, maybe bump them up a little bit just to have a little headroom. But that's a great thing. You can test it before actually doing the full production migration. Test it out, see if it works, do performance tests, see how things go, see what the resource consumption is like. And then if you find these are a little small, you can make them bigger, you can make them more, depending on the scalability of the application. Or if you see, we have way too much headroom, you can contract them as well. And then once you've done that right sizing activity and really optimize the sizing, then you can commit, you can purchase like a reserved instance or a savings plan. And that you're kind of saying, yeah, I'm going to use this size. The size is good for a while. And then in exchange for making that commitment, you get a discount on the ongoing operational cost of it. So a lot of flexibility. You're not just guessing once and hoping it's right. It's a constant tweaking, perhaps as you go. You've picked one size, but the usage of the application grows. You have more customers or more users. You can expand that in the future pretty painlessly. So it's a huge selling point of the cloud is that flexibility to go in and out, up and down.
Mm. Thanks for that. Before we move to Greg and cover cybersecurity, I think one of the biggest challenges and concerns that banking and financial institutions have on the IT side is cybersecurity. What are some tips that you can provide based on what you're hearing in the market for a secure transition from on-prem to the cloud, especially in very touchy applications and the data that they house and manage?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, security is definitely job zero for everybody. I think a good first step is understanding what you're getting with these different cloud providers, understanding how they look at security. Amazon in particular has a shared responsibility model where they're responsible for security of the cloud. They do that better than you ever could on-prem as far as physical security does, who can access what, who can get where, all that sort of thing. Whereas the customer is responsible for security in the cloud. So, for example, Amazon provides very secure environments, all kinds of different compliance and everything, but you still have the freedom to construct an incredibly insecure application with all the ports open and everything configured wrong. So it's really a team effort. So they provide security of the cloud, and then it's your responsibility for security in the cloud. So understanding where those lines are, who's responsible for what, is a great first step. And then once you understand what you're responsible for as a customer, figuring out the tooling and the processes and procedures to achieve the level of security that you want.
Thanks, Don.
Yep.
Greg, I think, as I mentioned earlier, cybersecurity, specifically in the cloud, is a concern, right? It's not necessarily new technology, but there's just so much happening out there with regards to news around cybersecurity threats and events. Would love to hear from you on, not only just some of the challenges that community banks and potentially credit unions are facing when it comes to cybersecurity. What do you say to clients when they say, cloud just isn't as secure as having everything on premises? Let's start there.
Yeah, so that's a good question. And I think when you really think about it, you do have this notion that, a bird in the hand is more secure than one that's out running wild, to be a bit funny with it. But that's the reality of the situation is, and I think Don hit on something really key here. Security is a team sport. A lot of times we get very focused, myopically so, on some of the impacts of breaches and the ransomware stuff and the some of the various different data leaks that we see, which those are really symptomatic, though, I think, of the environment in which we live. When we talk to customers a lot of times, and banks and other highly regulated industries as well, they get really focused on kind of that, how do I prevent a malicious attacker from getting into my environment? If I can get them in, how do I silo them off to keep them from doing collateral damage? How do I just keep it as limited impact? Which all that's important, and you've got very well defined security teams that focus on this. But I think a lot of times they lose perspective on the whole picture of what goes into cybersecurity. And I think this is where things like public cloud adoption really can shine. Don hit on it earlier when you're talking about things like physical access control, simply maintaining hardware, keeping it up to date, keeping BIOSes up to date, firmware stuff, all of this stuff that the security teams don't really have a hand in doing. That's operations. That's the IT teams, the folks that are walking the data center floors. And honestly, Don hit on it, the public cloud providers, Amazon being a prime example, they can do that much better than most of the organizations we work with, because that's their job, right? Their business is being in the business of IT. So when they're managing a data center, the physical controls they've got, the ability for them to keep their customers out of what we like to call technical debt, that's significant, because they can roll hardware at a pace that most customers can't. They can keep the underlying cloud operating systems up to date at a pace that most customers can't. And so when we're thinking about what cloud does, when a customer responds to me and says, hey, it's more secure if I keep it on-prem, I'm like, okay, well, let's talk through some of these things that you may not be thinking about. How up to date are the patches on your environment? Not just your OSs, but also your applications. How up to date are the BIOSes on your hardware? How much unsupported hardware do you have? What does your networking configuration look like? What does your architecture look like? Do you have holes there? So there's things in there that, if you're not viewing it as a consolidated security as everybody's job, then that's where you can run into problems. And that's where I think you gain a lot of benefit from the shared security model that Don talked about. And most of the major cloud providers have some form or another of this concept of shared responsibility when it comes to security. So things that I'm always going to be responsible for, things like identity and access management, things like my networking controls internal to my private environment, those sorts of things. What I've got, facing outwards to the public internet and such, those are things that are always going to be under my control. But I can allow the cloud provider to have the responsibility for securing the rest of it. So that takes things off of my people's plates, so that they can focus on the stuff that we think of when we think of cybersecurity, right? How do I contain breaches? How do I keep breaches from happening? How do I train my people? The other thing that the public cloud providers bring there's a lot of services that have been custom written. There's a lot of watchdog services and things like that are leveraging AI at a scale that the community bank down the street, even if it's a very big one, is not going to have access to on their own, or at least not easy access to, right? So you've got things that are learning. They're looking across a cloud environment with thousands, hundreds of thousands of environments, and they're learning. If they're seeing breaches going on over here, they can apply those learnings to the rest of the customer base. Those are all things that you're gaining when you're leveraging a public cloud environment that you do not necessarily have access to. Now, there are some exceptions to that, not necessarily exceptions to what's more secure or what's not. Don mentioned things like the software as a service model. Certainly, software as a service can play into play when we're thinking about EDR, XDR, things like that. There are a lot of as a service vendors that I would actually lump into public cloud providers that do these security services from a cloud control plane that can reach down into the local data center. But again, you're turning over some modicum of control to those folks, whether it's your monitoring or whether it's your software updates on these things. And once you get to the point where you're viewing this as a team sport and it's a collaborative thing, you can really get a lot of scale and additional capabilities from leveraging a public cloud provider as opposed to trying to do it yourself. Just because you've got a tight grip on it doesn't mean necessarily that it's going to be more secure. It always comes down to this balancing act. There's a balancing act between security versus accessibility. The most secure data center is one that's unplugged, but then it's completely unusable, right? So you've got to kind of figure out what that actually looks like. Where is that balance, and to what level am I going to trust a public cloud provider or a software as a service, cloud watchdog or something you think of like an Arctic Wolf or something like that, to do my SOC services or things like that for me. And once you can get to the point where you're dealing with them on that, it makes your life a lot simpler. It also provides you some added benefit when you start thinking about these regulated environments. So you think about a bank and they've got to meet their SecU requirements and their SOC requirements and their Sarbanes-Oxley requirements, and then there's probably PCI, and there's all kinds of requirements around how I deal with PII. And while a public cloud provider isn't necessarily, in most cases, responsible for meeting all of those requirements, they do provide a very nice set of documentation and tooling that will allow you to capture the required documentation for their piece of the puzzle. So again, it takes a lot of those sorts of things off of your team's plate, to where when, hey, I get audited and I need to provide this big checklist. Well, my checklist just went from these 100 pages to maybe it goes down to these 30 pages because 70 of them are just going to be cut and paste out of my cloud provider's documentation. And that even goes as far as if you need to have audit trails on access to certain types of data. There's tooling built into the public cloud that I can leverage that will give me that a lot of times a lot easier than it is for me to do so in an on-prem environment.
So, Greg, let me ask you there, as part of this security model, right, there's a lot of, I know, interest we see in terms of redoing your network, right? Specifically the WAN, there's proliferation of internet, SaaS-based applications. How does that all fit in with cybersecurity?
So, and I'm assuming you're talking about like the SD-WAN SASE model here, where really, and for those that aren't familiar with SASE, so it's secure access, secure edge. It's something that Gartner coined, but it's really the combination of SD-WAN technologies, so your software-defined wide area networking, with some of the secure edge technologies, and that actually plays a lot into the security posture for not only the public cloud, but also for those who are keeping their stuff on-prem. When you think about, there's a couple things that I think often plays into folks' mindset around security, and cost is unfortunately a big driver there. And so, what part of this SD-WAN SASE model lets me do is I can start thinking about taking some of the cost out of my networking by allowing me to have some leverage some commodity internet links and things like that. And part of that equation though has to be, how do I secure that edge? And that's where the SASE piece comes into it, where I'm taking those firewall services and I'm taking those intrusion detection services and things like that, and I'm putting them at the edge where the workloads are, so that they can be secure in those access points to the public internet, where they're going up to these points of presence, out and back down and around, whether it's to the public cloud environment or whether it's to applications or back to a central data center. I'm doing my checkpointing and all of my security there at the local areas. So when I'm thinking about things like, hey, Don mentioned Office 365 earlier. So if I've got an email and I'm leveraging Outlook Web Access or something like that, I'm not running those sorts of things through the virus detection and the ransomware detection and all that on my local machine, because it's just a web app, right? Or the browser is just reporting what it's seeing. So how do I prevent malicious software from taking those vectors? with a SASE model, I can essentially sandbox that stuff off. And if I've got the right software in place, I can run that in a sandbox before I present. If there's something malicious in theory, I'll catch it, right? 0-day exploits aside. It really lets me take the security from a centralized data center, which one creates a bottleneck, but two is really only good for stuff that's running inside the data center. And how do I take it out to the edge of my environment? So whether that's end user compute, whether that's mobile, whether that's edge data center, in a remote site, think a bank branch or something like that. It provides me additional capabilities to keep the environment secure by taking those networking related security services and putting them where the workloads and the points of egress are, or ingress as well.
So Greg, what are some of the accessibility challenges that come up when implementing security measures, and how would you overcome them?
Honestly, the accessibility piece to it, it comes into play whether you're talking an on-prem world or a public cloud world, right? Your identity access, how do I configure that? How am I leveraging things like two-factor authentication and things like that, so I can allow people access to what they need, but kind of secure it. There's been a lot of directory services. All right, great. We all get that. We understand Active Directory. We understand the various different LDAP sorts of directories that we have in the public cloud as well as on-prem, blah, blah, blah. But when we start thinking about, aside from permissioning, that's IT's job, and it will always be IT's job is permissioning, how do I grant that access and things like that? We're seeing a lot of chatter and discussion around things like two-factor authentication. You've seen a number of the public cloud providers. I think Microsoft just did it very recently, where they're no longer requiring mandatory password changes and things like that. They're in the two-factor authentication piece. Now, you could come down on either side of that discussion. When you're looking at something like two-factor authentication, and for those not familiar with, I know everybody's not familiar with, I got this thing on my phone, I've got to put in a number now. The reason for that is really you've got this concept of security at the end user now consists of something that I know, my password, and something that I have, my security key. And so I have to have both of those to gain access. And the thoughts are a password breach does not become as severe if I've got that other piece to the puzzle. So somebody not only has to have my password, but they also have to have the ability to get my authentication key. Far more rare than someone back in the day just being able to do a brute force on a password. I still think that I would be rotating those passwords at least somewhat frequently. I do appreciate the fact that I don't have to memorize a new password every 8 weeks. But yeah, so there's that, right? How do I implement those sorts of measures? And even when it goes further, once we start getting into biometrics and things like that, I think the days of the brute force attack, personal opinion, are waning. And so access controls are not going to be as significant, I don't think, as people gaining entrance through a user rather than spoofing a user. It's going to be folks that are impersonating a user, being able to get credentials and things like that by phishing a user, granting themselves permissions on the inside, so then they can start opening things up. And when we see things like the most recent attack on Microsoft and things like that, those were slow burn kind of attacks, right? It was working those channels. It wasn't just a quick hit. It was, I'm going to work over months and months and months, and as I gain access to something, I'm going to explore around and see what that has access to, and I'm going to grant myself access to it, and on and on and on. Those are things that are going to be, I think, the next frontier of how do we protect ourselves against those sorts of attacks. I think phishing attacks are always going to be there. People are still people. We're all when someone can invent people 2.0, I can't wait to see what that's like. But for right now, we all have very human behaviors. Perfect example, someone sent me a gift card last week. I couldn't wait to open the gift card, but I was like, hey, can I open that gift card? Is that real, or is that? So I spent an hour and a half agonizing over whether I should click the link to open the gift card. Finally, the person called me back and said, yeah, I did send that. I think, that's human nature, and that's, I think, the biggest challenge for most organizations, whether it's cybersecurity or otherwise. And I know Shad and Pradeep are going to talk about the ransomware stuff. What we've seen at Summit, the predominant means by which those sorts of attacks gain access is through phishing attempts. It's very rarely a open software breach, or somebody didn't patch this DLL or that DLL. It's somebody clicked something that they shouldn't have clicked, and off we go into this world of ransomware recovery.
Awesome. Greg, last question, and then we'll jump into the world of ransomware recovery. As a leader of an IT/security team at a bank or credit union, what different skill sets or certifications would you recommend having their or encouraging their teams to maintain and or build?
So a few things. Obviously, there's the technical certifications. So understanding, if I'm a primarily Amazon shop, right? Go get the Amazon certifications so you know what the various different services are that are available to you. You understand how they work, how they interact with the other services. Those are big ones. Outside of that, there are industry-specific certs, and you mentioned Shad's got an ISC2 certification. Things like the CISSP from ISC2. If you've ever taken one of those exams or studied for one of those exams, that is very much a holistic approach to security. So kind of taking it all the way back to when I first started talking about this, that concept of security doesn't occur in a bubble. It doesn't occur just at the edge. Like when you're studying for one of these industry exams, I remember specifically when I was studying for my CISSP back in the day, they wanted you to be able to say, how high of a fence did you need to have outside of a building to deter a casual intruder versus someone who is determined to get in, right? So those are the sorts of things, not that everybody needs to know, it needs to be a 10-foot fence versus this, that, or the other, but just understanding and having that vision that the security has to be a team focused thing. I think what I'd like to close with is the concept that a lot of times when we're talking with customers, and banks are no exception to this, the security teams don't talk effectively with the networking teams, don't talk effectively with the IT operations teams. And so you build these silos, and there is no, while you've got a security silo, security should never be a silo. It's got to be, this wrapper. But we see repeatedly security occurring in a silo, which is just inherently insecure.
Thanks so much, Greg. Awesome intel. So Shad, Pradeep, I'm going to hand it to you to dig into cloud disaster recovery and ransomware recovery. Where would you like to start?
Well, let's start with the traditional disaster recovery, if that's good with you, right? And that'll dovetail into ransomware recovery, I think, pretty nicely. So I can start. Let me, again, I'd say this is not unique to the banking industry in any sense. However, I think what we've seen at Summit is, right, a lot of the community banks, they do their best to keep up with trends in technology. But I think one area that lags behind the rest in that area is disaster recovery. And again, it's not anyone's fault, but architectures that are in place today for disaster recovery are 2 decades old, 2 or 3 decades old, right? And really the questions that we need to ask ourselves now are, what are we really protecting against, and what should we protect against? So if we think about what we're doing today, in most cases, you have production data center, and you replicate that entire data center. So you have the same footprint in a secondary location, and you copy the data, right? And those technologies have evolved over the time in terms of how much data you can protect, how fast you can get the data, the granularity of the data that you can restore. But the fundamental architecture hasn't evolved in decades. And it means it's 2x of a cost outlay that you need. And I have seen it in my experience over the years. People have gone through great lengths to say, oh, I need to get a return on that investment in my secondary data center. So I'm going to put some workloads over there, and I may start with just workloads I don't care to protect at all, but I'm getting something, all the way to the extreme of I'm going to run half my production workloads in data center A and half in data center B, and I'm going to use the same replication technology in each direction, right? What we would call bidirectional replication. And honestly, if we think about that, that makes your overall business continuity disaster recovery planning more complex, because now your workloads are split. So now you have to test everything in both directions. And one of the biggest challenges, aside from the fact that you're doubling your costs, right, with having two identical data centers, the other one that we see with these solutions is the operational challenge. Right, most customers will do a bubble test once a year. If they're really good, they might do two. The best ones I've seen will do quarterly. It's still just a bubble test, and most of these software solutions for DR have that ability that you can kind of simulate a failover, right? It doesn't disrupt replication, but it brings up a VM or a set of machines in an isolated network, and you can verify that you can at least boot up that machine and log into it. But that's as far as the isolated test goes. So then what happens in the event of a disaster? Right? I will steal a phrase that our VP of sales loves to use, which is the last thing you want to do in a disaster is think. Well, if all you're doing are bubble tests, you're going to have some serious thinking to do when you have a real disaster and have to flip over. And again, this is normal course of business for just about any entity that's been around, right, for any length of time. This is just sort of the way DR has been done forever. And I think now we're at a point where we have to really evaluate, is this the best thing that we should be doing for the business? And it fundamentally comes down to, this approach was meant to protect against physical failures, right? You have a component failure in your infrastructure, you have a power outage, you have a whole site failure, whatever, it's all physical related. And I know back in my career, most customers I've ever dealt with, when I ask the question, how long will you run fixing the problem, trying to resolve the problem in production before you declare a disaster? It's hours, usually 4+ hours. They'll try to fix the problem rather than running DR, which just highlights the complexity of both fully failing over, as well as the complexity of failing back, right? Which I think we all know, it's harder to actually fail back sometimes with certain architectures and solutions than it is to even fail over. So customers would go to great lengths to solve the problem in production and not have to run. So then all of a sudden it begs the question, well, even if you're doing bidirectional, you're still, well, if you never fail over because you never want to, how good is that solution working for you? So let's rethink what we can do here. And what we found is cloud is DR is one area where cloud, not always, but cloud has a chance to really reduce your expenses, right? And I think everybody knows nowadays, right? Cloud isn't less expensive than on-prem, right? If you're doing an apples for apples, there are ways around it. What Don talked about with the app modernization, if you're using, function as a service and all the and cloud native technologies, yes, you can reduce your costs. But generally speaking, I think everybody knows nowadays, if you're just kind of looking at a set of Windows machines, on-prem versus the cloud, cloud's not going to be less expensive and save you money. But in a DR scenario, it can, because now you don't need a full identical set of infrastructure to support your DR needs. You can replicate your data to the cloud. A lot of solutions will allow you to leverage low-cost object storage, and that's all you're paying for is the storage. And then those solutions can spin up in cloud native format. In AWS, you can go from S3, declare a disaster, and it will transform your machine and put it into EC2, right? And Now you're only paying for compute while you're in that DR scenario. And they do all have ability to fail back. Again, the big thing there is, can you test it? And how often do you test it, right? And build up that muscle memory. But that's where I think right now what we're seeing with customers is, let's reevaluate how you're architecting your DR solution and what your real needs are. And typically we can find a way that not just is more cost effective in the cloud, but actually can provide some operational efficiencies as well. And then I'll say, as I transition to Pradeep, ransomware recovery is really a whole separate process. That's one of the real big things that we've seen in talking to our customers, is that ransomware recovery, it's not just flipping a switch and failing over, because all you're doing is failing over and that traditional approach, we want to get up as fast as possible, get the business running. We had a power outage and we want that, whatever our last point in time is before the event, we need to get up and running and get the business back. In a ransomware event, it is much more surgical and deliberate. And the last thing you want to do is restore an infected copy of your data in your machine that just reinfects the solution. So there's a bigger process involved in analyzing that and also restoring it into a place where you can be protected in case that restored VM is infected. So I'll pause there. Let me, transition this over to Pradeep to get his thoughts on the ransomware recovery aspect.
Cool. Thanks, Shad. Yeah, that was, I think, a great background, actually, because a lot of customers that we speak to, they generally come to us and tell, oh, we already have a DR environment. Do we need a cyber event recovery platform or a cyber data vault, right? And that's usually where we have those discussions. And to what Shad mentioned, right? Like, I think a cyber data vault or a cyber recovery environment is more geared towards protecting or securing your data from ransomware. And when there is that ransomware attack, which has happened recently across many banks or other industries as well, you don't have access to any of your primary environment. It could be your primary data center or secondary. The basic assumption is that you don't have any of that access. The only thing you have access to is that data that you have stored in a vault, and you'll need to start recovering from that. And that's the premise that we go with when we talk to our customers. And what we've been helping a lot of our customers is to help them store the data in a secure vault somewhere. And when we generally talk about storing the data, it's obviously backing up the data, but also figuring out or helping them figure out how they restore or where they restore to. So if they lose access to their primary and secondary data centers, they're unable to restore it to that location, right? So where do they restore it to? Could they restore it to cloud? In that case, like, do you have your skills and your infrastructure as code templates to be able to recover from that environment into the cloud? So those are some of the things that we've been discussing about. And the second one is also about the security of the data, right? So if the perpetrator or the people who are doing the damage or the ransomware hackers have access to the primary environment, how do you stop them from accessing this backup or the vault environment? So that's one other thing. We need to make sure that this backup environment is totally air-gapped from your primary environment. So those are some things that we look into when talking to our customers, making sure that the data is immutable once you write it into the vault, such that someone who gains access to the vault is not able to just go and delete the data and then demand a ransom, right? So you want to make sure that the data stays in the vault and no one can change it, even an internal employee or an outside perpetrator. So you want to make sure that the data is secure. And as Shad mentioned, you want to make sure that the ransomware data or any kind of corrupted data is not being returned to the vault. So look at like some forensic tools to scan for the data, ensure that the data is clean before you write it to the vault so that you can get a clean copy of the data when you want to recover. So that's one thing. And the final thing is governance, right? So you want to look at or you want to ensure that the data is clean and there has not been an unauthorized access of the data, and all of that. So these are some of the things that we consider when a bank or a financial organization has to build this cyber recovery environment and recover from that. And it's not just ransomware attacks or malware attacks that's been affecting. We've also seen a rise in regulators asking banks to start protecting the data. So that's something that I think is just going to increase going forward. So apart from having the DR environment, customers or banks need to start looking at building this cyber recovery environment as well.
Cool. Go ahead.
Sorry, I just had a quick question, if that's all right. Are there differences in approach for that a small versus large financial institution would take towards ransom recovery, or is it kind of a one size fits all approach?
It does differ. So a small organization generally has a smaller footprint of their data, where they store it and where they recover it to, right? So if you take a large organization that has been there forever, and let's assume they have mainframe on premises, so they'll probably want to recover to another mainframe infrastructure. And obviously you can't run mainframe on AWS. So things do get complicated, and you'll have to plan that dependencies from one application to the other to be able to recover. So it does get a lot more complicated, and they'll have to identify what are their most critical applications. Usually we don't expect an organization to go and back up all of their 100% of their data, but we consider maybe the top 20, 25% of the data to be the most critical, and that's sort of what they back up. But if you are talking about a smaller organization, they might just have one important application, and that's sort of what they want to back up. So it really depends on who we are talking to here, and we take that as a case-by-case basis. I don't know, Shad, anything to add there?
Yeah, I'd say the other part of that is skill sets. In a large organization where yes, there's more complexity in terms of just the enormity of the types of data that they have and the amount of data that they have. Those institutions typically have much larger, more mature IT teams that can also help unravel and a lot of that complexity. The smaller IT teams and smaller companies, they may not have the skill set, or they have to, they should be looking at solutions that can augment their current team's skill set, right? Because there are some solutions that help automate and orchestrate some of these tasks, right? So that's the other part of that, right? Smaller teams should be looking for solutions that are as automated and orchestrated as they can find, versus larger institutions, which those solutions work great for, but they also may have multiple solutions, and they may use scripting, right? Or programming in the background to kind of stitch things together.
So this is the second conversation that I've had around disaster recovery and ransomware recovery, where testing and more testing and testing often and being able to test even more easily has been a focus, right? And a point of just making sure that the team can do that. So and this goes for anybody, where would you suggest that leaders of financial institutions on the IT side and security side, where would you suggest they start in being able to build a plan to recover from an incident? And then how often would you recommend as a testing schedule?
Well, I would say that to start, they probably all have to have a plan in place already today, as a highly regulated industry. The real question is, based on the size, those regulations are a little stricter, the more assets you have, right? But even beyond that, I think any size financial institution should be looking for ways to not just test for their own purposes, which they should do, but there's a secondary purpose in terms of having an audit trail that you have a solution that you can restore, that you can use with your insurance agencies, right? Cyber insurance is getting harder to get. And when you can get it, your premiums are getting more expensive. And I've even heard stories where even if you have something in place, the insurance company is looking for ways to not fulfill your claim if you have a breach, and they're looking for anything they can because it's so prevalent and so expensive. So having ways that you can document that you have a restore capability will help lower your premiums, if one, and that same document trail, if you actually ever have an event, will help you justify your claim. And the only way you do that is by doing tests, frequent tests, and even doing full kind of, we'll call it a simulation event, and actually running in DR, which will simulate a real disaster. How often? I mean, it's up to the customer and their maturity level. The full one, I think minimum annually, and then you got to do some other periodic isolated tests just
Yeah,
to
I
kind of
think
like muscle memory.
the guidance that I've always given customers on the how often, anytime there is a significant change to your environment, you need to retest your recovery plans. And there are, I mean, like if you look at some of the solutions, and I'll pick one that runs on AWS specifically. So VMware's got a disaster recovery solution with a ransomware capability that runs on top of the AWS platform. Even knowing when you've got changes in your environment that need to be retested can be tricky. So, if there are solutions that you can leverage, that being one of them, that can actually give you a heads up, hey, you changed something in your network configuration. I was using AI on the back end to look at the run books to see what might happen in the event of a failover. And this got flagged as a change that you might want to test to make sure it still works the way you think it would. So, one, if you make a significant change, but two, just again, this gets back to the team sport concept of it. If the networking team makes a change, the operations team that's going to be responsible for recovering things needs to be aware, because recovering it is one thing, giving people access to it, i.e. the network, is going to be something completely different. And all of that has to come together in a cohesive fashion. To Chad's point, you don't want to be thinking during one of these events, because that's how one of these security events becomes a resume generating event. And none of us need that.
Thanks so much for your input. Any other comments or questions for anybody else on the panel?
Other than I enjoyed it, no.
As did I, and I do want to thank you all for all of your insights, your tips, and sharing your thoughts on these cloud trends. And Pradeep, thank you for joining us today. If you did find this discussion helpful, please share this. If you would like to provide feedback or initiate a conversation around your cloud initiatives, challenges, or any operational needs that you might have, let us know at thesummitgrp.com. We're happy to help with a fully funded cloud roadmap or cloud cost analysis. We could even provide you with a ransomware recovery assessment. We look forward to hearing from you. And again, we hope this was helpful. Thank you for participating, everyone, and please enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you again.
Thanks, Gio.
Thank you all.
Thanks to you.
Thanks.